Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're just gonna give it a minute here so that everyone has a chance to log on before we begin. All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. So hello and welcome to today's fiscal year 2023 Flood Mitigation Assistance in Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, Notices of Funding Opportunities Tribal webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to provide a few housekeeping notes on today's Zoom webinar. If you're encountering any issues with meeting bandwidth, please turn off any VPNs. For other technical issues, you can ask questions via the Q&A pod available at the bottom of the screen or by email at FEMA-HMA-webinars@fema.dhs.gov. And this email will be chatted to you momentarily. This webinar will include a presentation followed by Q&A. Throughout the session, we invite you to submit questions for our speakers via the Q&A pod, which is accessible on the toolbar on the bottom of your Zoom screen. At the end of this session, we will ask you to respond to a few polling questions that will automatically pop up on your screen. Today's session is being recorded for those who are not able to attend. And with that, I'd like to introduce today's moderator, FEMA's Non-Disaster Grants Implementation Branch Chief, Ryan Janda.
Thank you so very much, Lee. Are we looking good?
Yes, you are all set.
Good afternoon. My name is Ryan Janda, and I am FEMA's Non-Disaster Grants Implementation Branch Chief in the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Division. Welcome to the fiscal year 2023 Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities and Flood Mitigation Assistance Notices of Funding Opportunity Tribal webinar. With me today are Carly Nicholson from the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, as well as Camille Crane from the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Program. Thank you both for your willingness and your care to be part of this webinar. On October 12th, 2023, FEMA published the fiscal year 2023 Notices of Funding Opportunity for the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Program and Flood Mitigation Assistance Program. Often those are referred to as BRIC and FMA. And they total $1.8 billion. BRIC's available funding is $1 billion, and the available funding from FMA is $800 million. These funds will help state, local, tribal, and territorial governments address high-level current and future risks to natural hazards such as extreme heat, wildfire, drought, hurricanes, earthquakes, and increased flooding to foster greater tribal resilience and reduce disaster suffering. FEMA has made a number of changes to reduce complexity across both programs and increase access to funding. I would like to highlight some changes which we hope will simplify the application process and emphasize the importance of building codes. To reduce barriers and make the BRIC and FMA grant programs more accessible for tribal nations, FEMA is reducing the discount rate for benefit cost analysis from 7% to 3%. This is a significant, as it will increase the value of future benefits for mitigation projects, allowing more climate-informed science to drive resilience to keep tribal nations safe for generations to come. FEMA is also making it easier for smaller mitigation projects to be considered cost-effective for the BRIC and FMA programs. To do this, we are allowing the submission of narrative statements for projects with a value of less than $1 million. This will enable more tribal nations to submit cost-effective projects and receive the needed funding as they are disproportionately affected by disasters. FEMA recognizes the importance of building codes and standards as part of the nation's climate strategy and remains a priority through the BRIC program. For this grant cycle, we are setting aside an additional amount of funding dedicated to building codes. We are referring to it as a plus-up, $25 million specifically for tribal nations. Additionally, this year's BRIC tribal set aside is $50 million. All federally recognized tribal governments may apply under the tribal set-aside, and up to $1 million of that tribal set-aside may be used for hazard mitigation planning and planning-related activities per applicant, meaning each tribe is its own applicant in that scenario. Finally, I would like to also highlight the equity focus of our BRIC and FMA grant program through several initiatives. The Community Disaster Resilience Zones Act, also known as CEDARS, was signed into law by President Joe Biden on December 20th, 2022. The act requires FEMA to utilize a natural hazard risk assessment index to identify census tracts which are most at risk from effects of natural hazards and climate change. Notably, the hazard mitigation projects performed within and or that primarily benefit a designated CEDARS, or again, the Community Disaster Resilience Zone, are eligible for an increase in BRIC cost share up to 90% federal, 10% non-federal, with the goal to lessen the impacts of disasters. Building resilient infrastructure in communities, direct technical assistance, BRIC DTA, if you will, provides tailored support to communities and tribal nations that may not have the resource to begin climate resilience planning and project solution design on their own. Through process-oriented, hand-in-hand assistance, FEMA, through BRIC DTA, will partner with tribal nations interested in enhancing their capability and capacity to design holistic, equitable hazard mitigation solutions that advance numerous tribal and community-driven objectives. Before I jump into the full content of today's webinar, I'd like to encourage you to supplement the information you will hear today by visiting FEMA.gov. There, you will find overview fact sheets on the funding opportunities for both programs, as well as very valuable program support materials. Thank you for attending today's webinar. Let's jump in. Let's go to the next slide. Before we dive into the details of hazard mitigation assistance non-disaster grants in fiscal year 2023, let's take a quick look at what's on our agenda today. We'll start by providing an overview of the most important aspects that eligible applicants and sub-applicants need to know during the fiscal year 2023 grant cycle. Our next topic will focus on the flood mitigation assistance, also known as the FMA grant program, its priorities, and how you can leverage its funding for flood mitigation projects and activities. And that'll be with Carly Nicholson. And then following FMA, we'll hear from Camille Crane, and we'll explore the Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, also known as the BRIC grant program, its guiding principles, and the opportunities it presents for building climate resilient communities. We'll then touch on the application process using FEMA grants outcomes, offering insights into successfully navigating the system, and provide information on the resources available to support your grant application and implementation processes. Our goal is to equip you with the knowledge and tools needed to make the most of these grant programs and to enhance the resilience of your communities. So let's get started with the first topic, hazard mitigation assistance, non-disaster grants in fiscal year 2023. Natural disasters are a global challenge, and their impact is felt by communities and tribal nations across the United States and around the world. From devastating floods and wildfires to destructive hurricanes and earthquakes, these events can result in immeasurable loss of life, property, and infrastructure, as well as cultural resources. As we confront the increasingly unpredictable forces of nature, it is our collective responsibility to work towards a safer and more resilient future. Let's go to the next slide. These grant opportunities are accessible to a broad range of entities. Eligible applicants include all 50 states, U.S. territories, federally recognized tribal governments, and the District of Columbia. And sub-applicants can be local governments, tribal governments, state agencies, and tribal agencies, and they're all eligible to participate. As a tribal nation, you may have the ability to apply either as a direct applicant to FEMA or as a sub-applicant to a state, depending on various factors, including your tribal laws and procedures, as well as laws of a state. If applying through a state, the state reviews and prioritizes sub-applications prior to its submission to FEMA for review. States may have already begun their notice of intent phase. If this is an avenue you want to pursue, tribal nations should reach out to applicable state officials to find out more about the process that state will undertake as a result of these funding opportunities. I'm going to say a statement now that I'm going to say it at least 2 more times. For flood-related projects, if you are participating in the National Flood Insurance Program, we encourage you to apply to both the Flood and Mitigation Assistance Program, as well as the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities programs to maximize your success. Let's go to the next slide. We encourage you to take a look at the 2023 Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program and Policy Guide for details on eligible activities. It's a phenomenal resource. If you open it up, there are a lot of pages. However, Control F is your friend, meaning Control Find, and you'll be able to find nearly anything that you're looking for when it comes down to our grant programs. Eligible activities include localized and non-localized flood risk reduction measures, acquisition and elevation activities, wildfire mitigation activities, and many, many more. At a high level, projects must be cost-effective, reduce or eliminate risk and damage from future natural hazards, meet the latest consensus codes, align with the hazard mitigation plan, and meet all environmental and historic preservation requirements. Okay, this is my second reminder. For flood-related projects, if you are participating in the National Flood Insurance Program, we encourage you to consider applying to both the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program as well as the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities programs to maximize your success. Let's go to the next slide. Here are some things to consider when applying to either or both of the programs, meaning the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program or Flood Mitigation Assistance. At a high level, they include, again, these things: Justice 40 Initiative, specifically Executive Order 14008, Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad, which was released in January of 2021. The Community Disaster Resilience Zones, which were announced by FEMA in September of 2023 for the initial, I believe, 483 communities that are touched by those selections. Future selections will be made by for both tribal nations as well as territories. Build America, Buy America Act, or BABA, which relates to infrastructure building materials, benefit cost analysis updates, phased projects, eligible activities, and key program changes for FMA and BRIC in fiscal year 2023. I'm going to remind just one more time, I don't want to be overly redundant, but for flood-related projects, if you are participating in the National Flood Insurance Program, we encourage you to apply both to the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program and the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities programs to maximize success. I'm trying to drive that home because we have not had an intentional tribal applicant to the FMA program, and that needs to change. We want tribal nations to be successful in the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program when you can be. Let's go to the next slide. Understanding the grant application cycle and funding deadlines is critical for a successful submission. The application period for fiscal year 2023 grants will be open from October 16th, 2023 to February 29th, 2024 at 3:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. This is your primary window to submit your proposals. Applicants who experience system-related issues will be addressed until 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on February 27th, 2024. So if you are experiencing a system-related issue, you need to contact the FEMA Go Help Desk at least 2 days prior to the application deadline, or again, 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on February 27th, 2024. This is something that happens every single fiscal year. So please do not wait until the very last moment to submit your grant applications if you're applying directly to FEMA, because if you have a system-related issue, we cannot address that if we hear about it after 3 p.m. on February 27th, 2024. Please note that FEMA deadlines refer to the application deadlines for the applicants. Again, if you're applying through the state reviews and prioritizes sub-applications prior to its submission to FEMA for review. States may have already begun their notice of intent phase. So tribal nations, if again you're looking to apply through a state based on your procedures, state laws or otherwise, reach out to your applicable state officials to find out more about their processes that the state will undertake as part of their process in these funding opportunities. Selections, which also include appeals for BRIC and reconsiderations for FMA, are anticipated to take place during the summer of 2024, which will then roll into the period of performance. Let's go to the next slide. The Biden-Harris administration signed Executive Order 14008, tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad in 2021. This order created a unique opportunity for FEMA to look at equity in a way more thoughtful way. And it's also called the Justice 40 Initiative, which promotes equity by aiming to deliver 40% of their overall benefits of climate, clean energy, affordable and sustainable housing, clean water, and other investments to disadvantaged communities and tribal nations that are marginalized, overburdened, and underserved. FEMA currently has 4 programs participating in Justice 40 Initiative, which include both programs we're talking about today. They were the founding, I think, Department of Homeland Security programs for Justice 40, and they are again the BRIC program and FMA. For BRIC and FMA, FEMA established a baseline to achieve that goal and will continue to build on that work to ensure equitable outcomes. Both BRIC and FMA are covered by Justice 40, and FEMA has made additional changes to advance equity in these programs. FEMA leadership will continue to evolve these programs to make strides towards the Justice 40 Initiative. The data and methodology to help with this effort will be identified in the annual grant program funding opportunities. The Justice 40 Climate and Environmental Justice Screening Tool will be used for future funding opportunities. Let's go to the next slide. Community disaster resilience zones will build disaster resilience across the nation by driving federal, public, and private resources to the most at-risk and in-need jurisdictions. The Community Disaster Resilience Zones Act, which we call the CEDARS Act, was signed into law by President Joe Biden on December 20th, 2022. The act amends the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act and requires FEMA to utilize a natural hazard risk assessment index to identify census tracts which are most at risk from the effects of natural hazards and climate change. Again, we have announced, I believe, again, the number of 483 initial communities that are designated for CEDARS, and we'll be identifying additional territory and tribal locations in the coming months. Let's go to the next slide. As part of President Biden's Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, beginning with awards received on or after May 14th, 2022, any infrastructure project receiving federal funding must source their iron, steel, manufactured products, and construction materials from the United States. Please note, BABA requirements apply to new awards made on or after January 1st, 2023, as well as new funding FEMA obligates to existing awards or through renewal awards where the new funding is obligated on or after January 1st, 2023. The important thing to note on talking about this particular provision is as you develop budgets and cost estimates for both the FMA and BRIC programs, please keep this particular requirement in the front of your mind, as some U.S. sourced materials may have a higher cost. So please account for that as you're developing your project cost estimates and as you're scoping your projects. Let's go to the next slide. FEMA requires all hazard mitigation projects to be cost effective. Applicants and sub-applicants may use one of 3 standard approaches. For projects with a total cost of less than $1 million, the sub-applicant may provide a narrative that includes qualitative and quantitative data demonstrating the project and cost effectiveness of a project. Pre-calculated benefits are another option. They're available for some project types, including acquisitions, elevations, wind retrofits, generator safe rooms, hospital generators, and post-wildfire mitigation. Or utilize the benefit cost analysis tools to show cost effectiveness for a project. Let's go to the next slide. FEMA will review hazard mitigation projects or applications during the pre-award process that are competitive and otherwise eligible for selection. For BRIC, a BCA or benefit cost ratio of at least 1.0 is not required at the time of application for federally recognized tribes. For FMA, federally recognized tribes can submit sub-applications also without completing a benefit cost analysis. These also apply for BRIC to economically disadvantaged rural communities and projects primarily benefiting community disaster resilience zones. And for FMA, it also applies for small impoverished communities and communities located with a community disaster resilience zone. For discount rate adjustments, we have a game changer for our particular programs. This is one of the largest and most impactful changes that has happened to hazard mitigation assistance and specifically for the BRIC and FMA programs, since they were first brought into being. And if a streamlined cost effectiveness determination method does not apply, we now allow a benefit cost analysis with a 3% discount rate. Again, that's a big deal. Going from the 7% discount rate to 3% in some cases may double the benefits of a project. So if you have been previously denied a project based on cost effectiveness, you may want to take a look at that project and see if a lower discount rate may make it a more cost-effective project this go around. Finally, let's go to the last slide that I'll be presenting on to you today, which is phase projects. The graphic depicts process of phase projects starting from sub-application submission and ending at phase 2. Tribal nations seeking federal funding for project development and evaluation without the financial risk of non-selection or lacking upfront capital can benefit from this approach, as it will streamline complex projects by dividing them into manageable phases and enables comprehensive development of technical and environmental data before granting full construction approval. Phase project funds are used to develop all the technical and environmental information, including design, engineering studies, and permitting before issuing a full construction approval. Phase projects allow you to build up your project. You don't have to have all the technical detail prepared in your sub-application at the time of submission. However, there must be some information in the sub-application that indicates that the proposed solution will resolve the identified flooding issue or hazard. Publicly available flood insurance data would be available for data that fulfills this requirement. It is not limited to only flood projects, so I want to just double down on that for just a second. Phase projects are especially useful for communities that cannot leverage upfront capital for project development without the assistance that they get from the grant. It provides a cushion for the uncertainty of being selected for an expensive, potentially resource-heavy application. So now, with everything that I've said, I'd now like to turn it over to Carly Nicholson. Carly is our Flood Mitigation Assistance Communications Lead, who will give an overview of the Notice of Funding Opportunity for the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program. Thank you very much, Carly.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you all for being here today. I'm thrilled to be able to present to you on the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program. Next slide, please. So let's get into the basics of the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program. So the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program, also known as FMA, makes federal funds available to states, U.S. territories, and federally recognized tribal governments and local governments to reduce or eliminate the risk of repetitive flood damage to buildings insured under the National Flood Insurance Program, also known as the NFIP, and within NFIP participating communities. The FMA program, from its inception, was designed to support the mutual objectives of reinforcing flood insurance and floodplain management policy. It accomplishes this by mitigating partially or completely high-risk repetitive or severe repetitive loss properties or buildings. It is a competitive grant program offered annually during a specific application period, which runs at the same time as our Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, also known as BRIC. And as Ryan mentioned earlier, in FY23, FEMA will be able to disperse up to $800 million under the FMA program this year. So we're really excited about that. And tribal governments have the option to apply as their own applicant or as a sub-applicant to a state. So there's that flexibility there. Next slide, please. So let's get into some of the flood mitigation assistance eligibility requirements. Now we kind of have a little bit of an understanding for the purpose of the program. Let's talk about eligibility requirements. So as with all hazard mitigation programs, FEMA requires applicants and sub-applicants to maintain a FEMA-approved state or tribal hazard mitigation plan, both at the application deadline and when the funding is obligated. However, and here's the big thing, the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program does have additional requirements as funding is appropriated from the National Flood Insurance Program policyholders. So sub-applicants must be active participants in the National Flood Insurance Program without probation or suspension, and all buildings in the project sub-application must be insured under the NFIP throughout the mitigation process. So I'm going to refer you to our awesome program support materials and our NOFA for additional eligibility information, but that's the real big thing up front. And now you may be thinking, okay, Carly, how do I find out if my community is participating in the National Flood Insurance Program? Well, the good news is there is an awesome resource we have, which is called the Community Status Book on FEMA.gov that will give you this information. So I highly encourage you to go there to verify if your community is an NFIP participating community. We're looking to get tribal projects funded under FMA, and we do really look forward to seeing those applications here in the future. So take a look at that Community Status Book to see if your community is participating. Next slide. So as Ryan mentioned earlier, there are some key changes in the program this year. And so I'll detail some of those specific changes related to the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program. So in fiscal year 23, we introduced key changes that enhance impact. And here they are. So we increase funding on localized flood risk reduction projects, which ensures targeted support where it's needed most. And we're going to get into the details of what localized flood risk reduction projects are in a few slides. We also, additionally, the federal cost share cap for mitigation reconstruction was raised from $150,000 last year or in prior years to $220,000 per structure in this fiscal year cycle. We are now utilizing the Centers for Disease Control Social Vulnerability Index, or CDC SPI, themes such as socioeconomic status, household characteristics, and housing type, and transportation scores for the enhanced bill or bipartisan infrastructure law federal cost share, which provides a more nuanced approach to project funding. We also have changes in the final priority scoring criteria, in tiebreakers, and in thresholds that aim to optimize project selection and ensure the most impactful mitigation efforts possible. Additionally, increasing the individual flood mitigation project priority to 75% of the flood mitigation assistance and NFIP severe repetitive loss, or you may hear me say SRL, and repetitive loss, or RL, up from previous year, which was 50%. And then lastly, in addition, the equity data measure has been evolving from the CDC SBI to the CGEST, or Justice 40 Communities, as well as Community Disaster Resilience Zone, ensuring a more comprehensive consideration of equity, of community needs, and of resilience. Next slide, please. So as mentioned earlier, we have $800 million available for the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program this year. Really exciting. This is the second year that we've had this large number, and we're really excited to see what sorts of projects that we get in this next year. And so to break down exactly where those dollars are going to be at here. So the fiscal year 2023 funding order in federal activity caps include CNCB. So we have up to $60 million for capability and capacity building activities, also known as CNCB, which enhance knowledge, skills, and expertise of the current workforce to expand or improve the administration of FMA. And the whole point of this project type really is to foster and develop future localized flood risk reduction projects and individual property flood mitigation projects. So if you have some ideas around a project and you really want to flesh it out a little bit more, this is an option for you to kind of build that capacity and that skill, in your workforce to be able to develop some of these projects in the future. We also have $520 million available, or up to $520 million available for the localized flood risk reduction projects, which address community flood risk for the purpose of reducing claims against the NFIP. And then finally, we have up to $220 million for individual flood mitigation projects that mitigate the risk of flooding to individual NFIP insured buildings. Next slide, please. So a little bit of detail about these various project types. So I mentioned that we have up to $60 million available to support capability and capacity building, with the idea that these projects aim to expand or improve administration of FMA and to foster the development of future projects. So there are various caps which are listed here for various activity caps. I'm not going to go through each one of those, but one I do really want to highlight is the other CNCB activities or other capability and capacity building activities. This gives you the option to develop, things like severe repetitive loss or repetitive loss strategies and enhancing local floodplain management. So there's some flexibility with that one, and we encourage you to consider what other capability and capacity building activities might be possible. Next slide, please. So localized flood risk reduction projects. Again, we have up to $520 million available for localized flood risk reduction projects, which are designed to mitigate community flood risk and reduce the NFIP floodplain payments. So each sub-application, this is a big thing, something really important here. Each sub-application is subject to a $50 million cap for eligible projects that include things like floodwater management, restoration, stormwater control, and flood control projects. If you're interested in learning more about localized flood control, we actually did another webinar back in September on localized flood control projects. We gave examples. We went through this project type a little more in depth, and I'm hoping that our awesome tech folks are able to drop that link in the chat for you all as a great resource to go back and watch. There is a recording available of that webinar. Next slide, please. Awesome. So with localized flood risk reduction projects, we have benefiting area maps. So localized flood risk reduction projects must showcase benefits to the National Flood Insurance Program insured properties by ensuring your application includes a map, a geospatial map outlining the project area, the footprint boundary, and the benefiting area, in line with flood modeling such as an H&H study. So these are things to be keeping in mind. We do need to see that geospatial file. And this graphic here just provides an example of how the benefiting area maps should be submitted in an application for this project type. Next slide, please. So here we have a graphic related to our federal cost share for both the capability and capacity building activity project type, as well as localized flood risk reduction. The big takeaway from this cost share graphic is that all eligible applicants from federally recognized tribal governments will receive a 90% federal cost share. And we encourage you to take a look again at that community status book to verify if your community participates in the NFIP. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the individual flood mitigation project. Again, we have $220 million available there, allocated for the individual property flood mitigation projects, and they are targeted at flood risk at the NFIP insured structure. So this is at that level. There is no activity cap per sub-application, and eligible projects include things like acquisitions such as structural demolition. This can include structure elevation and mitigation reconstruction, which again, new this year, we allow up to $220,000 federal share per structure. Next slide, pretty please. And again, we have an awesome cost share graphic here on individual property flood mitigation, again, for applications from federally recognized tribal governments that meet all eligibility criteria will be offered a 90% cost share for individual property flood mitigation projects. We encourage you again to take a look at that community status book to verify your status, your community status, and see if it is participating in the National Flood Insurance Program. And the building has a current contract for the flood insurance under the National Flood Insurance Program. So I know I keep saying it over and over again, but that awesome resource, the community status book, is going to be your best friend for verifying that information to see if you might be eligible for the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program. Next slide, please. So as we conclude our discussion with the FMA grant program, we've identified diverse opportunities here that are significant in bolstering community resilience, for capability and capacity building activities that empower us with the knowledge and skills, and for localized flood risk reduction projects, that that are aimed at addressing flood risk at that community level, and then talked about the individual property flood mitigation projects that safeguard NFIP insured structures. FEMA offers a comprehensive suite of tools at our disposal, and this initiative initiates collectively enhancing our capability to mitigate the impact of natural disasters and reinforce our commitment to building a safer and more resilient future for all. With that, thank you all. I really appreciate the time today, and I'm going to pass it over to Camille, who will be presenting on the Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, or BRIC program. Thank you.
Thank you, Carly. So yes, my name is Camille Crane. I am the program manager for the Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, or BRIC, grant program. And I'm very happy to be coming to you today via telephone to go over our opportunities in FY23 in the BRIC program, specifically for our tribal partners. As I go to the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about how you might come into the BRIC program as either an applicant or a sub-applicant. So starting with the applicant, Ryan showed a graphic back in the beginning of the webinar about who are eligible applicants and sub-applicants for our program. So federally recognized tribes are eligible as a direct applicant to FEMA. So a federally recognized tribe can come directly to FEMA and apply as an applicant. So in doing that, there's some considerations that the federally recognized tribe will want to think about. As a direct applicant to FEMA, there is a responsibility to both develop an overall grant application as well as the individual project or what we call project sub-applications. So a tribal government might decide to apply for 2 or 3 or 4, a limited number of sub-applications or projects. Each one of those would be an individual sub-application. And then the tribal government would need to put all those individual sub-applications into an application, since they are also applying directly to FEMA. As an applicant, the federally recognized tribe has access to the BRIC tribal set-aside. So this is a dedicated funding source for federally recognized tribes that come to FEMA as applicants. So there's access to that set-aside. There's also access to the new Tribal Building Codes Plus Up, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. There is a disaster declaration requirement, but because back in 2020, when we had the COVID pandemic, everywhere in the country was covered by a disaster declaration at the same time. And because that happened, that basically gave all federally recognized tribes a 7-year buy-in for BRIC. So for this year, there's no disaster declaration requirement. You can get, as an applicant, management costs at both the sub-application and application level. You could potentially be eligible for increased cost shares under the economically disadvantaged rural community, or potentially the community disaster resilience zone designations. Please note, as of today, November 2nd, those designations have not been made for tribal governments yet, but if those are made in advance of the close of the application period, then that cost share would be active. Also, as an applicant, you must have a FEMA approved plan, hazard mitigation plan, both at time of application deadline and time of obligation of funding. As I go to the next slide, I'm going to talk about what it looks like if you were to apply as a sub-applicant. So a sub-applicant is could be a non-federally recognized tribal agency, or it could be a federally recognized tribal agency if that were the choice. So this is when you're developing a project application, but you're submitting that most likely to a state to be included in their application. So because you're actually submitting under a state, you don't have access to the tribal set-aside. Instead, you have access to the tribal fund, to the state funds or the territory funds. So for example, that would be state and territory allocations. So each state and territory in 23 has an allocation of funding to them of $2 million. They also have a $2 million allocation for the Building Codes Plus Up. And then there's the national competition. Applicants, tribal applicants can also apply to national competition, but that's only if we basically get more applications than the $50 million tribal set-aside. With management costs, you would only get it at the project level, so the sub-application. You still could potentially be eligible for the increased cost shares under the economically disadvantaged rural community or CDRZ designations. You still have to have a tribal hazard mitigation plan at the time of application deadline and the time of obligation of funds, unless you're applying for mitigation planning, partnerships, or building code projects. So now I'm going to go more into the specifics of this year's program. So on the next slide, it talks about what are the fiscal year 2023 BRIC priorities. And these priorities are actually the same as the priorities we had last year in FY22, as we stay aligned to the administration's priorities on climate and equity, that also are the agency's priorities per our strategic plan. So our priorities for FY23 are to incentivize natural hazard risk reduction activities that mitigate multi-hazard risk to public infrastructure and disadvantaged communities as referenced in Executive Order 14008. So as a reminder, 14008 is also known as Justice 40, and all tribal entities have been designated as disadvantaged per that executive order. To incorporate nature-based solutions, including those designed to reduce carbon emissions, to enhance climate resilience and adaptation, to increase funding to applicants to facilitate the adoption and enforcement of the newest edition of building codes, which is, you'll hopefully clearly see through our addition of the Building Codes Plus Up. And of course, we encourage projects that meet multiple of these priorities. As we go to the next slide, I want to talk about across the program how much funding is available, and then we can drill down into those that are specific for tribal nations. So as you heard Ryan talk about at the opening, there is $1 billion in total across the BRIC program for FY23. That splits out into a few different buckets. The first is, I talked a little bit about the state and territory allocation. So that is up to $2 million per each state and territory. So that's 56 different organizations with the 50 states, the 5 territories, and the District of Columbia. So that equals about $112 million. And in that state and territory allocation, they can apply for capacity and capability building project types as well as mitigation project types. Then we have the Building Code Plus Up. So the Building Code Plus Up is purely for building code projects. And there is another $2 million per applicant for state and territories. So that's another $112 million there. And then there is a tribal Building Code Plus Up. So $25 million for federally recognized tribes to apply for building code projects. And that could be adoption of code, implementation of code, training of code officials, enforcement of code, bettering, like maybe improving code or doing other things that support code implementation in your communities. Then we have the tribal set-aside. So we are staying with the same amount we had last year. So even though our program value has decreased this year in FY23, we kept our tribal set-aside at $50 million. Last year, we received just about $50 million in eligible projects. So we wanted to keep that support there for our federally recognized tribal partners. So $50 million, this is a combination, or can be a combination of capacity and capability building project types, as well as mitigation projects. There is an unlimited number of sub-applications that a tribal organization, federally recognized tribe, can submit to the tribal set-aside. One thing to note, though, is your capacity and capability building project type can't be more than $2 million federal share, and of that $2 million, no more than $1 million being spent on mitigation planning. Then finally, we have our national competition, which is where the balance of the funding for this year will be spent. So somewhere around $700 million. There's not a cap for how many projects any applicant can send to the national competition. They can each be valued at $50 million apiece. The national competition is open to any applicants, so states, tribal governments, federally recognized tribes, I should say, and territories. One thing to note is we will keep all the applications from federally recognized tribes in the tribal set aside unless we have in excess of that $50 million. And in that case, we would fund the capacity and capability building projects first, and then we would apply the scoring criteria for the national competition on those tribal sub-applications for projects. And we would fund all we could through the tribal set aside, and then the rest of them would go to the national competition, where they would go in rank order with other projects from states and local governments, for example. As I go to the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit more and just kind of repeat about the Building Code Plus Up. This is new for this year. This is something that Building Codes has been a priority for the BRIC program since its first year in FY20, but we just haven't seen the building code projects that we would like to see. We haven't seen the number of projects that we would like to see. And part of that is we realized the building code projects had to compete with other projects in the allocations and the tribal set aside. So we wanted to give a dedicated funding source this year, try that, and see if we could encourage more building code projects. So once again, for federally recognized tribes, it's a $25 million set aside for building code projects. You can see here on the screen, there's different ways or different uses of this funding, whether through adoption or implementation, enhancing existing code, or moving to higher standards, developing training or other technical assistance. And if for any reason this fund is not used, then those funds could either go back to the disaster relief fund for a future grant cycle, or could be kicked over to the national competition. As we go to the next slide, it's just another graphic that shows you the kind of the breakdown that I just went over verbally, which is the different funding buckets mapped to the different uses of assistance. So you'll see under there, management cost is available across all the different funding buckets. Capacity and capability building project types are available in the state and territory allocation and the tribal set aside. Building codes are one of the project types of a capacity and capability building activity. And so you'll see that's why it's eligible under the allocation, the tribal set aside, but then it's the only thing eligible under the plus up, both state and territory building code plus up and tribal building code plus up. And then hazard mitigation projects, so more of your construction projects, those are eligible under the tribal set aside state and territory allocation, as well as they're the only thing we do in the national competition. As we go to the next slide, we're going to talk about some of the key changes. And we've talked about some of these already, but just to kind of put it all here in one place. Some of the key changes for the BRIC program in fiscal year 2023. So we've gone over this building code plus up and what it is and how much it is, both for federally recognized tribes as well as state and territories. As we talk about how we look at equity, particularly the data sources we use, we have moved away from CDC SCI as we do not have a regulatory or legislative requirement to use it, and instead are going to the CGES tool, which has been developed by the White House in support of Justice 40, and the community disaster resilience zones, because that legislation does include an increased cost share for the BRIC program. There is a requirement for state and territories in their allocation to have a minimum spend on projects that primarily benefit community disaster resilience zones. I want to be clear to note this minimum spend for projects benefiting CDRZs does not follow into the tribal set aside. So there is not a minimum spend on CEDARs in the tribal set aside. Aligning ourselves to the flood mitigation assistance programs for projects, we are asking for benefiting area maps as well. So following along with the requirement in that program. And that helps us understand where the project benefits are actually going, so we can denote which census tracts, which communities are actually receiving those benefits. Ryan talked to you about the different streamlined cost-effectiveness determination methods and cost-effectiveness or benefit cost analysis assistance. So those good news, we're very excited about those changes. He talked about the 3% discount rate, the under $1 million quantitative narrative, as well as the BCA assistance that is available for all federally recognized tribes. This is basically, you do not have to have a BCA at time of application, but you do need to have one if you were to be selected at time of award, and FEMA would assist you in putting those together. And then the national competition, we did have changes in our scoring. And once again, that only would affect tribal sub-applications or tribal applications. It'll only affect tribal sub-applications if they're coming under a non-tribal applicant, such as the state. And for federally recognized tribes that are coming to FEMA directly, it would only affect them if we had more submissions than we had set aside funding available, so more than the $50 million. But there have been changes in the national competition as well. As we go to the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about what are the cost shares. Carly talked about the cost shares in the flood mitigation program. Likewise, we have cost share in the BRIC program too. Generally, the cost share in BRIC is 75% federal and 25% non-federal. There are, one thing I always want to note is that 25% non-federal does not have to be cash. It can be cash, but it also can be in-kind services, donated labor, and some other federal funds that lose their federal identity when they basically go down to the next level, such as the Community Development Block Grant from HUD. We do have a couple of different cost shares in the program depending on who is the subapplicant. So the first one is if you're an economically disadvantaged rural community, meaning you have a population of 3,000 or less that is economically disadvantaged, you can get a 90% cost share. If the project primarily benefits census tracts that have been designated as community disaster resilient zones, that would also get a 90% cost share. And then we do offer 100% federal funds for the management cost. So there isn't a cost share requirement for the management cost. As I go to the next slide, I have mentioned capability and capacity building activities a few times. And if you're wondering what are capability and capacity building activities, there are 4 primary ones that we look at in the BRIC program. The first one is building codes. So we've talked a lot about building codes. The second one is partnerships. So we know that to increase community resilience, it's going to take more typically, probably, than just federal funding. So we want to help communities, tribal nations build strategic partnerships to help you advance your mission or your goals to be resilient to natural hazards, and so we can help fund that. Project scoping is one I get very excited about, and that is, I like to think of it as seed money to help you figure out, you have an issue, like you have a flood risk, but you just don't know what to do about it, so you're not ready to put in a complete project application. So you just need some seed money to help you scope out a project. So it helps you figure out what's the solution or what are the mitigation opportunities to reduce your risk to whatever natural hazard it might be. And then potentially develop an application out of it to come in for a future cycle of BRIC or another program. And then the last one is hazard mitigation planning. So what we've talked about, that hazard mitigation plans are a requirement in our programs. And so this is funding to help create a plan. If you don't have one, update your plan as they're required to be updated every 5 years. Incorporate your plan into other mitigation plan into other planning that you may have in your organization, and implement that plan. One thing to note is while there is a planning requirement for projects and project scoping, if you're applying for a mitigation plan, there's no planning requirement to already have a plan. The next slide I'm going to go to is we talked about the grant side of the house and all the funding that's available. I also want to talk about the piece of our program that has nothing to do with the grant funding, and that is our BRIC Direct Technical Assistance, or BRIC DTA. You heard Ryan mention this at the top too. We know for some organizations coming into the program for a grant is maybe a bar too high right now. And so we wanted to offer another opportunity to still get this assistance to help communities, tribal nations advance their goals in climate resilience, but do it in a way that was offering hands-on technical assistance in communities and doesn't look like a grant. So what this ends up being is it is a simplified request that you put in, and there's going to be a form linked in a minute in the webinar, and you submit it to an email inbox, and if chosen, you become a DTA community with us, and we will work with you in developing an action plan. And you can see here on the screen several different things that the action plan can have in it. Anywhere from starting kind of ground steps and putting plans together, building community engagement, building partnerships, all the way to developing project sub-applications and getting those submitted. And then if funded, if that project sub-application is funded, it actually could help you implement or close the grant. DTA offerings, if selected, are for up to 36 months and are offered with FEMA staff and or our partners. As we go to the next slide, it'll talk about who is eligible for BRIC DTA. And so you'll see a list there of eligible entities for BRIC DTA, including federally recognized tribal governments and any groupings of those entities that are listed there. To note, to be a recipient of BRIC DTA, you do not have to have a BRIC grant application, nor do you have to have an approved hazard mitigation plan. And as we look at the next slide, that is where you'll see a copy of or a link to the request form that is available on the BRIC DTA website, as well as the email inbox to submit that request form. We have the same application deadline as the grant side of the house. So that is February 29th, 2024 at 3 p.m. And then on the next slide, before I leave you talking about BRIC and go into some of our closing materials before we get to our Q&A, I wanted to show you just a few different tribal examples, selection examples from our last cycle. So these are 3 different applications or projects that came from federally recognized tribes. And then I wanted to show you kind of the differences that can be in what's being requested, from a project that will raise a dam to increase water capture, particularly to look at drought issues that falls in the category of utility and infrastructure protection, to project scoping dollars to look at electric grids or a microgrid solution to offer both green energy but also energy resiliency for a tribal government, and then an ability to put in safe rooms, to have protected spaces for tribal members as they might need somewhere to be safe in a tornado, for example, outside of their home. So next, we're going to talk about how to apply. So if you're interested in the dollars, either for FMA or the BRIC program, you're going to need to go to FEMA Go, or FEMA Grant Outcomes. So as we go to the next slide, there is a few key information about application best practices, sort of your do's and don'ts that you want to think about when you're developing these sub-applications or applications. And that includes making sure you're using clear and consistent naming conventions for all your attachments you're providing, supporting documentation. If you might be considering, if your project is larger and you don't have all your materials, or you don't have all the requirements together for a full application, you might consider project scoping or phasing that project. Make sure you're looking at the Nofo and the programmatic support materials to ensure that the application you're developing aligns with those documents. As you look at the don't side, make sure you're not including inaccurate information. You're not forgetting to attach your documents. You're not providing unclear directions of a level of support, and always make sure you're connecting your project to a natural hazard. So you want to make sure there's that connection to, we know exactly what you're mitigating against. On the next slide is where you're going to find information about how to get to FEMA Go, so the portal as well as the help desk. One thing to note is you do have to register in the FEMA Go system before you can start entering your application. So if you're thinking about applying, please do, and you have never applied before, please do that as soon as possible. That's something you don't want to wait until the last minute to do. To note, our application period is currently open. It closes on February 29th, 2024 at 3 p.m. We do ask you to try to submit early, as we need to know if you're going to have any issues in submitting, so system constraints, like the system is not working, on to basically 48 hours in advance, which is February 27th, 2024. And please note, this is FEMA's deadline, so the deadline between applicants to FEMA. If you're applying as a sub-applicant, so through a state, they are going to have deadlines before the FEMA deadline. So please ensure you're coordinating with that, whoever is going to serve as your applicant. And once again, just to drill into something Ryan said multiple times, please consider applying for both programs if your project is eligible for both. Finally, we're going to talk about the program support materials and resources. I'm going to first show a slide that lists a series of program support materials as well as links to the FMA and BRIC website. You'll see materials that are built for each of the programs, as well as some materials that are available for both of the programs. These are on our website. I would also heavily suggest that you download a copy of this PowerPoint or this presentation. It should have been available when you were signing on as a downloadable feature. Next slide is just going over more resources. So these are ones that are not just BRIC and FMA, but they're in the hazard mitigation assistance space, such as benefit cost analysis, the FEMA Go system, other things that we think will be helpful to you in putting together your sub-applications. And then the next slide is a listing of our helpline. So this is phone numbers, email addresses, and websites where you can, if you need help in completing your application, or you have questions, these are where you can go for assistance. And I would heavily recommend for all of our federally recognized tribal governments that you also are utilizing your FEMA regional tribal liaisons that are available in each of the FEMA regions and coordinating with them. So with that, I think we're at the end of the presentation. And Ryan, I'm going to turn the floor back over to you to answer questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Camille. Thank you very much, Carly. I wanted to double down on something you just said, Camille, and that is for the tribal nations that are on the call right now, your primary conduit to FEMA assistance is typically the FEMA tribal liaison in the regional offices. They are a fantastic resource to get information. In some regions, there are additional folks that are specifically hired to assist tribes, especially in the hazard mitigation assistance branches in some of the regional offices. But please start with reaching out with your regional tribal liaisons for information on any of what you've just seen, and they will help guide you through the process. There are a lot of program support materials, and we aren't trying to overwhelm you with these program support materials, but we're trying to make them topical. So there are a lot of different again, program support materials you saw on the screen, but there are a couple that are really, really, really important. And if you're applying for a large project from a tribe and you're thinking it's going to go into the competitive side of the BRIC program, there is a qualitative criteria program support material, as well as a technical criteria program support material that you will really want to take a look at. And we'd like to see you be successful in the national competition for BRIC. So with me saying some of that, we're going to go over to some questions now. For those of you on the line, please feel free to submit questions into that Q&A pod at the bottom of the screen. You see Q&A with mine shows a little red, sort of like a rounded square or an oval with the number 18 in it. But if you go into that area and submit your question, we will try to get to you. So with me saying that, I am going to go over to the team and start asking you guys some questions. So Eddie, we're going to start with number 1. When will the tribal CDRS or community disaster resilience zone maps come out?
Hi, thanks, Ryan. FEMA is planning on announcing the additional designations that include tribal lands this fall.
Thank you, Eddie. And Camille will go over to number 2. The question is, I understand tribes can apply under the state, but can local entities like counties apply under a tribe, especially when the county resources directly affect tribal citizens?
So thank you, Ryan. Let me kind of try to fill all this out, and then let me also say that there's some nuances in this as well. So local governments are encouraged to always partner with tribal nations. We know that there is, in some cases, those things are very closely connected, right? The local government and the tribal members, including tribal members living in counties and cities and different local organizations. So federally recognized tribes can submit, once again, sub-applications directly to FEMA as an applicant for the tribal set-aside. Federally recognized tribes can also submit applications to the state as a sub-applicant. Local governments, such as counties, should be submitting typically are going to be submitting their sub-applications to the state. So typically a county would submit that sub-application to the state. I know from conversations with tribal nations around the country where they basically want to partner with towns and apply projects on their behalf. And I think those have to be looked at on a case-by-case basis, because in some cases there may be specific state law or there may be specific tribal laws that will either allow or not allow that to happen. So I don't think that, for a national webinar today, I cannot give a specific answer on a local government like a city applying directly to a federally recognized tribe instead of going through either their county or their state. But if that is something that you're working on now, I heavily suggest you engage with your regional offices so we can start looking at the specifics on those issues to see if that, how we could potentially support that type of arrangement.
Thank you, Camille. And maybe just add one more thing to what Camille was just saying is we are continuously learning about how to deliver these grant programs. And this particular very specific question is something that we just started looking at in the last, I don't think it's been a year now. And it is really a difficult one to noodle through. So thank you very much, Camille. And thank you very much for the question too. So we're going to go over to number 5 now. Kevin, this one I think is for you. If applying for FMA grants, besides the HM plan, the hazard mitigation plan activity, does the tribe need to have insured properties to apply for local flood reduction projects or other projects?
Thank you so much, Ryan. With flood mitigation assistance, there's the 3 categories or types of projects we have. We have the capability and capacity building, such as project scoping. Those type of projects do not require to have insured properties. We also have, as mentioned in the question, the localized flood risk reduction projects. Those also are not required to have insured properties in the benefiting area. Now, if you are looking to create an application with elevation of individual mitigation structures, those projects will require insurance policies for each of those structures. And it's also important to note the main requirement for those capability and capacity building and localized flood risk reduction projects is just they have to be participating in the National Flood Insurance Program, not withdrawn on probation or suspended. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you, Kevin. And we are very, very eager to see a tribe apply successfully to the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program. If you haven't heard me say that already at least once today. Let's go over to question number 3. Eddie, I think this one is for you. How could a non-federally recognized tribe apply, and what would the requirements be?
Sure, Ryan. Camille touched on this a little bit during the applying as a sub-application portion of the presentation. Any tribe or authorized tribal organization, Alaska Native village, or organization that's not a federally recognized tribe is defined as a local government per Title 44. So this means that you would apply as a sub-applicant to the eligible state or territory.
Thank you, Eddie. And Charlie, I think you're up for number 4. The question is, my apologies. What are the requirements for qualifying as a disadvantaged community? Is there still a population of 3,000 or under requirement?
Hey, yes. For that question, the answer is yes. To qualify as an economically disadvantaged rural community and receive the enhanced 90/10 federal cost share, it still is legislatively defined as a community of 3,000 or fewer individuals, identified by the applicant, with residents having an average per capita annual income not exceeding 80% of the national per capita income.
Thank you very much, Charlie. Something that we have learned in the last several years, because again, we continue to learn, is that there are different population centers across many, many tribes. And one of the things that had been looked at in the past is a look at the entire tribal population. And again, we're trying to get a little smarter, trying to learn. And if there are population clusters within a tribe, that may help you when you take a look at that 3,000 person population limit for being an economically disadvantaged rural community. This would be a fantastic question for a tribe to ask the original tribal liaison, how they can navigate that. And if the tribal liaison needs assistance, we at headquarters are more than happy to work with them. So let's go to another question. Camille, I think the next one is for you. If you have the document open, number 6. If a tribe does apply for both FMA and BRIC for a flood project, would they be able to receive funding through both, or would one be selected over the other? How does the process work?
Thank you, Ryan. So no, you cannot be funded under both, but why we want you to apply is because our teams across FMA and BRIC, when we are looking to see how we can maximize the funding, if we have projects that are submitted to both, we'll look at, for example, does FMA offer a better cost share for that project than BRIC would? And so if so, we would put it towards the BRIC program. Or, for example, one of our programs like BRIC has a tendency to be oversubscribed. And so we may have more eligible project sub-applications than we have funding available. And so we might be able to, have FMA select that project instead with some of their funding available. So it's just a matter of us being able to maximize the dollars between the two programs and provide program funding from the programs that will be most advantageous. But to do that, we need the project submitted to both programs. So hopefully that helps.
Thank you, Camille. I'm going to take number 11 really quick. The question is, do you provide CFM or certified floodplain manager credits for these webinars? And the simple answer is no. However, that might be something for us to think about in the future. So thank you very much for the question, and we will take that back and look and see if that might be a possibility for the future. So thank you very much for the question. Let's go over to question number 12. Eddie, I think this one's coming your way too. So this question is, again, number 12, for sub-applicants eligible for BCA assistance, is this only available to projects submitted under the competitive bucket, or is it also an option for projects submitted under the state and/or tribal allocation?
Thanks, Ryan. So BCA assistance is available for projects submitted by federally recognized tribes for both the tribal set-aside and the competition. Ryan mentioned PSMs. I'm going to try to call attention to one here in particular. In particular, the PSM is titled Cost Effectiveness and Benefit Cost Analysis, Technical Assistance for Communities. I know it's quite a mouthful. As mentioned before, federally recognized tribal governments are eligible for BCA assistance. And what this means is that applicants can submit without or with an incomplete benefit cost analysis. We encourage everyone to go ahead and review this PSM, whether you plan on submitting a BCA or not. And the recommendations in there are for minimum information, and it's divided by project type that FEMA can leverage to develop a BCA for you. So if you have that information available, it's tremendously helpful for us when we're working to put together your BCA.
Thank you, Eddie. And I'm going to go over to Camille for number 14. For any of you on the line, if you want to submit a question, please go ahead and go to the Q&A pod at the bottom of the screen. Also, I'm starting to see some folks leave the webinar. Could we pull up the polling question now? And this will allow us to find out who is on the webinar, as far as like where you're from, and what you thought of this webinar. So we want to get your feedback really quick to make sure that we've got some information about how we're doing, and this will allow us to know how we can possibly improve for the future. So thank you. I think, Camille, I was going to you for number 14. And I think the question is, please clarify how much each application can be for the set-aside.
Thanks, Ryan. So let me take you through a walk on the different funding buckets again, and see if this can help provide some clarification. So looking at the tribal set-aside, it's $50 million. Each federally recognized tribe can submit an unlimited number of sub-applications to that tribal set-aside. But there are a few caps within that unlimited number of sub-applications. So what does that mean? That means that there's no, each sub-application doesn't have a cap, but there may be a cap overall on different funding categories. So for example, the capacity and capability building activities are capped for tribal, federally recognized tribes at $2 million each. So that means each federally recognized tribe cannot apply for more than $2 million of capacity and capability building project types. Of that $2 million, no more than $1 million can be spent on mitigation planning. So there isn't so much a cap of how much per sub-application, there's just a total cap. So for example, a tribe may use the entire $2 million to put into project scoping, or they may apply for a couple of mitigation planning sub-applications that total no more than $1 million, a couple of partnership, a couple of project scoping. It's just the total can't be more than $2 million. And then on the mitigation project side, there is a cap that no more than any sub-application of a mitigation project can be more than $50 million. I do recognize that while we have a $50 million federal share on mitigation projects, that is also the total of the tribal set-aside. For example, if in the case that we ended up with more sub-applications than $50 million worth from federally recognized tribes, we would have to, as I described in the webinar, basically maximize the tribal set-aside, but then also put some of those sub-project sub-applications, some of those mitigation projects into the national competition. Just to note, there is also the ability in each sub-application, so a cap in each sub-application, 5% can be spent on management costs. That's cost to manage the sub-award. And then up to 10% can be put in for information dissemination activities. So that might include public awareness, education, brochures, workshops, things like that. That is also eligible. And then in addition, if you are a federally recognized tribe applying as an applicant, like I said, 5% for each sub-application or each project. And then you can also apply as an applicant as part of your application for 10% management costs across your sub-applications to manage your suite of sub-applications.
Many thanks, Camille. Benjamin, I know that there were a couple of pre-questions that we had put up here for CGEST, CEDARS, as well as GET and WRAPT. Are you on the line right now, Benjamin?
Yeah, I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah. So let me ask you question number one. What resources or tools does FEMA have to support grant applicants specifically related to CGEST and CEDARS?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So FEMA has worked really closely, with our grant programs to develop the grant equity threshold tool. And we have some information in the chat about the tool, but essentially it provides important information regarding different community populations in both the CGEST disadvantaged communities and also in FEMA's CEDARS, the community disaster resilient zones. So really that tool can help grant applicants demonstrate how their benefiting area supports the Justice 40 initiative by focusing efforts on those disadvantaged communities. And another tool that we have is the resilience analysis and planning tool. We'll be sure to put a link to that in the chat. And that basically provides kind of demographic hazard and infrastructure information that can also be used to enhance grant applications. Both of those are freely available to the public and you don't need a login for them.
And I think that there's a webinar coming up in the next couple of weeks. Is that correct?
That is correct. My office, the Technical Assistance Branch, will be hosting a webinar specifically geared towards grant applicants. And it will demonstrate the functionality and the information in both the grant equity threshold tool and in the resilience analysis and planning tool. That webinar will be held on Tuesday, November 14th from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern. I believe the registration link was put in the chat. So we encourage anybody who's interested in learning how those tools can help support and augment your grant applications. We recommend that you attend that.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. Camille, I think I'm coming back to you for number 10. The question is, if applying to develop a new hazard mitigation plan, how does the requirement to have an approved plan apply? If updating a plan and the plan expires prior to being awarded, can it still be awarded?
Thanks, Ryan. So the question is related to mitigation planning. So a mitigation plan is required at time of application and time of award for any project type except mitigation plans, building code projects, and partnerships. So if your project is to update your mitigation plan and you have, it expires sometimes during the review process, that does not stop the award since that having a mitigation plan is not a requirement for a planning grant.
Thank you. I know that we are running low on questions right now, so if there are any last minute questions from anybody on the line, feel free to put that in the Q&A pod. There was a question about the max number of sub-applications a tribe can submit to BRIC or FMA. Essentially, the answer is no, there's not a number that is a maximum number. However, if you take a look at the notice of funding opportunity, you'll see that there are certain dollar caps, as we've talked about over the course of the webinar and during some of the questions, where we can't exceed X amount for certain activities. So please take a look at that, at the notices of funding opportunity for some of those limitations when it comes down to the amounts for BRIC or FMA for sub-applications, but there is not a limit on the number of sub-applications that you can submit. And I think, unless my team tells me I am missing something else, that could possibly be it.
Ryan, I just saw a question come in.
Please go for it, Eddie.
Sure. Number 15 is, when will the instructions for completing a BCA narrative be added to the FEMA website, or where can we find instructions for the BCA narrative? The answer to that one is that the PSM for BCA narratives is now available on the BRIC resources page, and we'll ask the web team to drop it in the chat as well. This will also be cross-posted on the FEMA BCA website coming soon.
Many thanks, Eddie. We have a lot of resources that we've made available for this application cycle. Again, I know that some of them, I know that there's a lot of them. But we are trying to be responsive to all of those very topical areas with our program support materials, and we do hope you find them to be beneficial. I think at this point, not seeing any additional questions, I want to thank again Carly Nicholson from the Flood Mitigation Assistance section, as well as Camille Crane, our BRIC section chief, for their fantastic presentation today, as well as the support from the team, from Eddie, Charlie, Benjamin, Kevin, and maybe somebody else I possibly forgot, for your assistance during the Q&A process, as well as the behind the scenes team on everything that is taken to make this a successful webinar, and just fantastic partnership across the entire team. It really does make a difference in making these a fantastic webinar. So again, I know that you all have many things to do. Your time is limited. Thank you for making this a priority in your day, and have a great day.